All right. Welcome, everyone. I am so thrilled to have you joining us today.
Yeah, it is great to be here. We've got a really wild one today.
We really do. We have a genuinely fascinating exploration lined up for you, stepping inside the mind of, well, one of the modern era's most iconic and honestly polarizing figures.
Definitely polarizing.
Right. We're looking at an extensive stack of notes and excerpts drawn directly from Walter Isaacson's authoritative biography of Steve Jobs.
Which is just a massive, incredible source.
It is. But to be clear, right up front with you, our mission today isn't just to recount the corporate history of Apple. You already know they make phones and computers.
Right. You've probably got one in your pocket right now.
Exactly. Instead, we're here to dissect the intensely contradictory forces that drove its founder. We're going to explore this bizarre intersection of 1970s counterculture and hard-nosed technology, the profound power of intuition, and the undeniable, often painful reality of genius. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it, because it really is an incredible set of material to dig into. When you look closely at his life, you don't just see the linear trajectory of a tech CEO.
No, not at all.
You see this massive collision of psychology, environment, and just a terrifying force of will. To truly understand why the products that revolutionized our world look and feel the way they do,
Yeah.
you have to understand the deeply complex human being who demanded they be created in a very specific, uncompromising way.
Exactly. And to understand him, the Isaacson material makes it clear we have to start in the very beginning with this defining psychological blueprint.
The adoption story.
Right. When Steve Jobs was just, I think, 6 or 7 years old, he was sitting on the lawn of his house talking to a girl from across the street. And he casually mentioned he was adopted.
As kids do.
Yeah. But the girl looked at him and asked, "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" Yeah, Jobs later said that lightning bolts went off in his head. He ran inside, crying hysterically. But his adoptive parents, Paul and Clara, sat him down, looked him straight in the eye, and said with absolute emphasis, "No, you don't understand. We specifically picked you out."
What's fascinating here is the profound duality that single moment created in his developing mind.
How so?
Well, on one hand, you have the lingering subconscious trauma of feeling abandoned by his biological parents.
Right.
But on the other hand, he was explicitly told he was chosen. He was special. That collision abandonment and specialness forged a personality that required absolute control over his environment. He eventually came to see his creations, his products, not just as machines, but as literal extensions of himself.
Wait, so you're saying the obsession with closed systems like Apple, historically not letting users open up the hardware or, tinker with the software, you think that traces all the way back to a 6-year-old on a lawn needing control so he wouldn't be abandoned again?
Absolutely. Think about it. If the product is an extension of his own identity, he has to control it perfectly, end to end, so it won't let him down. He just couldn't handle the vulnerability of an open system.
Wow. That makes so much sense.
Hmm.
And he also realized pretty early on that he viewed the world differently than the people who chose him. There's this incredible anecdote about a carbon microphone.
Oh, I love this story.
It's so telling. So his adoptive father, Paul, was a mechanic. He's a very hands-on guy who loved restoring old cars.
Yeah.
One day, a neighbor who was a ham radio operator showed Steve a carbon microphone hooked up to a battery and a speaker.
Right.
Steve went home and told his dad about it, but Paul insisted that a carbon microphone needed an electronic amplifier to work. It couldn't just work on its own.
Which, to be fair to his dad, was conventional wisdom for most microphones at the time.
Right. But Steve drags his dad down the street and proves him wrong. The carbon microphone actually didn't need the amplifier. And Jobs later said that moment brought him tremendous guilt because the illusion of his parents knowing everything just shattered.
He realized he was smarter than them.
Exactly. He suddenly realized he was smarter than his parents. But it also crystallized that feeling of being completely separate and special. I mean, have you ever had a moment in your own life where you suddenly realized your mentors or your parents just didn't have all the answers?
It's a jarring feeling.
It really is. And for you listening, that massive shift in worldview is exactly what propelled Jobs to start relying almost entirely on his own intuition rather than conventional authority.
And that reliance on intuition was really nurtured by the bizarre environment he happened to grow up in. The Bay Area in the early 1970s wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active ingredient in his development. It provided the perfect soil for his specific temperament.
It's such a strange contrast, though. You have guys dropping acid and seeking enlightenment on one side of town, and then aerospace engineers building radar tech on the other. How did those two completely different worlds actually mix?
That is the magic of Silicon Valley at that exact moment. You had the massive military-industrial complex operating right alongside this exploding counterculture, and the bridge between them was something called the Whole Earth Catalog.
Published by Stuart Brands.
Exactly. It famously ended its final issue with the phrase, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." The catalog treated tools, including early computers, as instruments of personal power. It was this amazing cultural pivot where computers stopped being viewed as these Orwellian giant mainframes used by the Pentagon to track citizens.
Right, the big, scary, room-sized machines.
Exactly, and they were suddenly reimagined as tools of personal liberation.
Power to the people, but through microchips.
Precisely. And Jobs consciously immersed himself in both of those worlds. Consider his brief time at Reed College. He hated the required classes, so he just dropped out to stop spending his working-class parents' tuition money.
But he didn't leave.
No, he stayed on campus, sleeping on the floor of friends' dorm rooms, and he just dropped in on the classes that actually interested him.
Including a calligraphy class, which sounds like a punchline for a tech founder. But he learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, the varying spaces between letters, the history of typography. He just found it beautiful.
But here is the ultimate takeaway for you as a listener. Jobs realized that tech specs processing power, memory, eventually just become a commodity.
Right. Anyone can build a fast circuit board.
Exactly. That seemingly random, intuitive choice to study calligraphy is the direct reason why the personal computers you use today have beautiful, proportionally spaced fonts. He actively positioned himself at the intersection of the humanities and the sciences. He knew that to build something lasting, you had to marry technology with artistry and human emotion.
But to actually build that technology, he couldn't do it alone. We all know Woz was the engineering brains of the early Apple days.
Steve Wozniak.
Right, a brilliant, socially awkward engineering genius whose father was a rocket scientist, and his dad exalted engineering above all else, teaching Wozniak to value extreme, absolute honesty and to never seek the limelight.
Their dynamic was perfectly complementary, but what the Isaacson biography really highlights is the absolute friction in their moral compasses.
Oh, big time.
It starts with this defining early adventure involving something called a blue box. Wozniak read an article about hackers who figured out that if you generated a very specific audio tone, I think it was 2600 hertz, you could fool AT&T's call routing switches and make free long-distance phone calls.
So Wozniak, being the wizard he was, built a digital version of this device.
Right.
And they used it for the ultimate pranks. Wozniak actually used the blue box to call the Vatican, pretending to be Henry Kissinger, trying to wake up the Pope.
Which is hilarious. But Jobs immediately saw a different angle. He realized they could manufacture these and sell them.
Wait, so they were actually selling these illegal hacking devices out of college dorms?
Yes, and it almost got them killed. There was this terrifying moment where they were trying to sell a blue box outside a pizza parlor, and the buyer pulled a gun on Jobs and robbed him of the device right there in the parking lot. Yeah, it shows the real-world stakes of what started as a nerdy prank. But that caper is crucial to understanding their future. It established the exact template for Apple.
Wozniak invents something brilliant purely for the fun of it.
Exactly. Left to his own devices, Woz wanted to give his computer schematics away for free to his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club. It was Jobs who possessed the vision and the sheer audacity to figure out how to package it, price it, and sell it.
But that drive had a really dark side. And here's where it gets really interesting because it shows the ethical divide between them. Jobs got a gig at Atari working on a single-player version of the video game Pong.
A classic.
The founder of Atari told Jobs there would be a financial bonus for every microchip he could eliminate from the machine's design. So Jobs recruited Wozniak to do the engineering in just 4 days, promising to split the base fee. Woz, pulling all-nighters, managed to design the game using an impossibly low 45 chips.
It was an incredibly elegant design.
It was. So Jobs took half the base fee, gave it to Woz, but secretly kept the entire massive bonus for the saved chips for himself. He flat out lied to his best friend.
And what's heartbreaking about that detail is that Wozniak found out about it years later, reading a book about the history of Atari. Wozniak said that if Jobs had simply told him he needed the money, he would have just given it to him.
Man.
It highlights a fundamental difference in how they viewed the world. Wozniak was driven by a pure engineering ethic. He wanted to be in the middle of the pack, just one of the guys. Jobs was driven by an unyielding ambition, a compulsion to win that sometimes allowed him to bend his own morality to achieve his ends.
That bending of reality is a recurring theme, because while he was hustling at Atari, Jobs was also on this intense spiritual quest. He traveled to India for 7 months, coming back barefoot, wearing saffron robes, and adopting these extreme, obsessive fruitarian diets.
He actually believed that if he only ate fruit, his body wouldn't produce mucus and therefore he didn't need to shower.
Which his colleagues at Atari strongly disagreed with. The smell was so bad he was banished to the night shift.
It's the irony of seeking Eastern enlightenment but using those techniques to manipulate people. His time at Reed College introduced him to a charismatic student named Robert Friedland, who ran an apple orchard commune.
Right.
Friedland was a larger-than-life figure who demanded to be the center of attention. Jobs studied him closely. He learned how to weaponize uncomfortable silences. He learned how to use unblinking stares to intimidate people. He learned how to project such intense certainty that he could literally bend reality to his will, the famous reality distortion field.
Which perfectly primed him for his relationship with Mike Markula. Markula was an early investor in Apple who became a massive father figure to Jobs. Markula wrote a one-page paper outlining Apple's marketing philosophy built on 3 principles: empathy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, impute is the idea that people absolutely do judge a book by its cover. The signals you send tell the customer what to think of your product.
Huh.
If you present something in a slipshod manner, it will be perceived as slipshod. Think about how it feels to unbox an Apple product today. The heavy cardstock, the slow glide of the lid lifting off. That all traces back to this one-pager.
It's why Jobs obsessed over the plastic case of the Apple II. He wandered the aisles of Macy's, looking at Cuisinart food processors, deciding the computer needed to be sleek and approachable in an exact, highly debated shade of beige.
He even cared about the invisible layout of the circuit boards inside the machine.
Nobody was ever going to see them.
I know, but it goes back to a lesson his adoptive father taught him about always finishing the hidden back of a wooden fence, just for the sake of true craftsmanship.
And that obsession with the user experience leads us to one of the most famous turning points in tech history, the raid on Xerox PR Arc. Jobs negotiated a deal to let Xerox invest in Apple, but the catch was they had to show him what their top-secret research lab in Palo Alto was working on.
This is a legendary moment.
It is. When Jobs got in there, he saw their graphical user interface, the GUI. Up until this point, using a computer meant typing green text on a black screen. But Xerox had bitmap screens. Instead of just spitting out lines of text, the computer controls every single pixel individually, meaning you could draw literal folders and trash cans on the screen. Jobs literally started hopping around the room.
He was shouting, "You're sitting on a gold mine. I can't believe Xerox is not taking advantage of this."
Yes.
Which brings up the endless debate. Did Apple steal the idea of the desktop and the mouse from Xerox?
Did they?
Yes, they absolutely did. But Isaacson makes a critical distinction in the text. Xerox invented it, but Apple executed it. The difference between a lab experiment and a consumer product is massive. Xerox had a complicated mouse that cost $300, had 3 buttons, and didn't roll smoothly at all.
So what did Jobs do?
Jobs went to an industrial design firm and demanded a $15 single-button mouse that could roll on a Formica table or a pair of blue jeans.
Right, and the Xerox engineers hadn't even figured out how to make their digital windows overlap on the screen. It was just a tiled grid. An Apple engineer named Bill Atkinson had to invent entirely new, complex coding for overlapping regions just to make the digital desktop feel like papers on a real physical desk.
It's brilliant.
It is. I want you to reflect on that in your own work for a second. Having a groundbreaking, visionary idea is maybe 10% of the battle. The other 90% is the relentless, grueling, uncompromising execution required to actually make that idea accessible and useful to everyday people.
It's that execution that requires a leader willing to push people beyond their perceived limits. Jobs used his reality distortion field to convince his engineering team they could achieve the impossible. But it's that exact same intensity, that inability to compromise, that demand for absolute control that created a profoundly messy reality in his personal life. He could be exceptionally cruel.
It's honestly hard to read some of these sections in the biography. When he was 23, which chillingly is the exact same age his biological father was when he abandoned him, Jobs' on-and-off girlfriend, Chris Ann Brennan, got pregnant.
And he just disconnected.
Completely disconnected. He flat out denied paternity, even though he knew he was the only one she was seeing. He essentially willed the reality of his own child out of existence.
The delusion was staggering. Even after a DNA test proved he was the father, he cited a fabricated, nonsensical statistic to a Time magazine reporter, claiming that 28% of the male population in the United States could be the father.
That's insane.
He dragged the mother of his child through the welfare system rather than support them.
Wait, hold on. He's actively telling a national reporter he isn't the father of this girl, Lisa. But around the exact same time, he names Apple's massive new multi-million-dollar computer project the Lisa.
Yes, it's a glaring psychological paradox. When pressed by his team, he claimed LISA was just an acronym for Local Integrated Systems Architecture,
Which the engineers jokingly called invented stupid acronym. And that coldness wasn't just reserved for romantic partners, it extended to his closest friends. Daniel Kotke was his soulmate from college. They dropped acid together, they traveled through India together. Kotke was one of the very first employees building computers in the Jobs family garage.
You were brothers, essentially.
Yes, but when Apple went public, an IPO that valued the company at $1.79 billion overnight, Jobs flat out refused to give Kotke any stock options. He just froze him out and left Kotke crying in the office, and it completely shattered their friendship.
This raises an important question for anyone studying history or business or leadership. How do we reconcile these two halves of the same person?
It's tough.
It is. On one side, you have the visionary who desperately wanted to create machines of loving grace, who deeply understood that the intersection of art and science could elevate humanity. On the other side, you have a man who could be incredibly unfeeling and brutal to the individuals who loved him most. He was an absolute genius at connecting humanity with technology, but he was deeply, fundamentally flawed at connecting with actual, individual humans.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize everything we've talked about today, Steve Jobs wasn't just a traditional buttoned-up businessman making gadgets. He was a product of the 1960s Bay Area counterculture. He was shaped by profound feelings of abandonment, fueled by a relentless desire for absolute control and perfection, and armed with an intuitive Zen-like focus that allowed him to see the future of computing years before anyone else could even imagine it.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought to mull over. We so often want our historical heroes to be perfectly moral, kind, easygoing people. We want them to be good friends and good parents. But when you look at the sheer terrifying force of will required to bend the entire world to his specific vision, we have to ask ourselves, if Steve Jobs had been a well-adjusted, easygoing, nice guy, would the personal computer revolution as we know it even exist? Or is that level of world-changing, paradigm-shifting innovation fundamentally dependent on the very demons that made him so incredibly difficult to be around?
Wow. That is a heavy, fascinating thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We covered a lot of ground today, from carbon microphones and illegal blue boxes to the messy realities of genius. Keep asking those big questions, keep examining the contradictions, and above all, stay curious. Catch you next time.